very unfortunately, Resolve decided to, instead of use the word transfer function, they used the word gamma. So it's a little bit confusing because gamma is actually a subset of transfer functions. Welcome to the next video in the series about color grading. Today we're going to be focusing on color management. That seemed to be the topic that most people were interested in. But we're also going to look at how cameras capture light, because it's very important. And we're going to look at post-production workflows and how color management fits into this, these two very important aspects. So let's get on with it. As you know, we are in a production process. Post-production sits near the end after the shoot, and we are specifically talking about the color grade and the online edit that sit after in a feature film workflow, they sit after the visual effects and obviously after the offline edit. And what's becoming quite true now is that colorists are literally the last stop, in that they do final checks. They even do the online sometimes. They're the ones sending the picture off and doing all sorts of versioning over and above creative grading. In a broad sense, all we need to do is take this log encoded footage that the camera records, and we need to grade it beautifully and export it, and we're done. Obviously, there's way more to it, right? Within the grading process, we need to conform the footage, the raw files, match back to the shots that the editor has chosen. We need to create a look. We need to do shot-by-shot matching. We're going to go in and do fine details if time and budget allow, and if the job needs it. We're also going to do different versions for different deliveries. Nowadays it's vertical version, horizontal version for social media, television, cinema, more and more versions and more things to know about in the world of delivery. So if we look at the production workflow in general, typically speaking, as I mentioned last time, we have this situation where we have a kind of a isolation between pre-production, shooting, and post-production. And definitely kind of an isolation also between the offline edit and the online edit. And so in terms of the visual continuity between these departments, we get a lot of problems. And you might think this is not so important. You might think, okay, we're focusing on the edit now, we're not looking at the color. We're focusing on the shoot now, all we're doing is capturing dynamic range. We'll deal with it later. Now, when we're focusing on the grade, don't worry about anything else. We'll reset our brains and we'll start from zero, and we'll focus on color. Especially on long projects, it doesn't work that way. People get really set into being used to something, and it's very hard to change their minds afterwards. Also, in terms of if you on set shooting and spending a lot of time with this footage, if you're just looking at plain old footage and it's supposed to be a period piece or it's supposed to be futuristic, if you're also looking at it with a creative show light applied, your feeling and your level of inspiration and your motivation and your creative edge will be way enhanced. So it's something that we definitely want to work towards. And as colorists, we're very well positioned to advise the entire pipeline on how we should and coordinate with the cinematographer to work out how this production is going to be done. The problem is, the camera's recording the log encoded footage. Great. On set, people are just applying the manufacturer LUT, and so this is what they see. Then in the offline, the editor gets given log files with no grade applied, so they apply their own grade. Could be good, could be bad, but it's made with different set of tools, so the results will definitely be different. Then the final grade might end up looking like that. So a much better way to do it is through the whole process. If on set we can have viewing LUTs, the files that are given to the offline editor have the look applied and burnt in time code for matching back for safety. VFX vendors actually get the show LUT for the job, and so that they can apply just as a viewing LUT, they're not baking it into the footage, but they can apply it and they can get the feeling as to how all their layers are going to feel once inside the correct viewing environment and creative look for the particular job. And then obviously in the final grade, that's what we're focusing on. So first off, let's look at the shoot. And what's so hard about capturing an image? What have camera manufacturers worked so hard to do with their cameras? So let's look at the light that's actually coming into a camera on a particular shot. We can walk around with a spot meter and we can take readings. For those of you who aren't familiar, these are in stops, f-stops, so that every step up is basically double the light. So from 1 to 2, 2 to 2.4, to 2.8, to 4, 5.6, 8. These are all increments that are used to say the amount of light being read is doubled. Double each time. So let's look at that in some example scenes. These are bracketed exposures that are taken just on a Canon stills camera, so not going through any particularly idealized color management or anything like that, but just taken as an example of an image. Each different image is one stop down. So you can see it's quite a big jump, half the light. I'm going to put up the scopes here, and we can see, although this is not a particularly scientific test, it's just done with what I had available. What I want you to do is look at the middle line here. So this 512, this halfway through the 10-bit signal, let's just use that as a reference point, because often, once the image has been properly color managed, that's where the gray chart or mid-section might lie, depending. But let's have a look at that level and see. So if we go all the way back to the beginning, I mean, we have the sun here. I'm going down and down and down and down. The image was actually clipped, so I've kind of pulled it down the last few stops. I actually ran out of range. The sun was even brighter. So what you're seeing here would be even more. But basically, now we've got the sun itself down to the 50% mark. So let's see how many stops it takes, and each stop is doubling the light to get to the darkest part of the image is now raised up also to this 50% level. If we step through 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 3. So roughly like 23, 24 stops, which is, to be expected. This is a dark evening, sun's gone. So this is kind of the ambient light. And these are, underneath a roof, very well shaded, not getting any skylight, compared to the sun. Even though it is, going through a thicker piece of atmosphere, it's slightly darker than at midday, but still, it's hugely bright. So, 20-something stops, which is quite impressive. If I group all those to this multiple view, you can see that it's a huge range. From here, we're just seeing the sun, everything else is completely black, to is all totally burnt out. What I want to emphasize is the light source in this shot, which is obviously the sun. You can see that the actual light source itself is hugely bright. It's many, many stops, doubling, like at one story of a building, like you doubling the height every time. But it's a very small area. But you can see that as we get to the middle, it kind of expands and expands and expands. So it's almost like a bit of a tapered kind of Eiffel Tower shape. And that's often what these, the bulb of a light or the sun or the speculars, they occupy a very small amount of pixels on the image. They're hugely bright, but they're definitely a small percentage in terms of the total pixel count of the image, which is a very interesting characteristic. This is a slightly more overcast, so you can see that the range will be way smaller. And the brightest thing we have here is probably these reflections on this water tank. At the starting point, you can see that that's just below 50%. And as we step through, again, doubling each time, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. And you can see the darkest parts of this barbecue here. We have 13 stops in this particular scene. And each scene's different, I'll go on to the next one. At one stage, I was taking a lot of these just very kind of informally, not with any particular scientific precision, but just to kind of find out what kind of ranges were we typically talking about. This is at a temple in Taiwan, and you can see that the sunlight exterior is very bright compared to the inside. The inside's very dark. So the normal exposure is kind of somewhere here, either slightly exposed for inside or exposed here for the outside. And these are 2 stops, so it's 4 times the light between each step. In this particular scene, so that's 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14. And that's most of the image gone. But you see the specular here on this metallic urn is way above. It's another 6 stops and still going. You see the image is actually clipped. The final peak would actually be several stops higher. So quite fascinating to see the actual, call it, structure of the light that's actually presented to the camera. This car looking a bit sorry for itself. We have the wheel arch here, which is actually quite dark. This is again 2 stops per each, so 4 times the light. So there, the wheel arch and these shaded parts under the car are on 50%. As we go marching downwards, 2 stops at a time, 8, 10, 12, 14. Most of the image is gone, but these speculars on the bumper and these shiny parts of the car take at least another 6 stops. Would be a 20 stop of range if we're really going to include these speculars. But you see how little of the picture area they actually involve. So we have the bulk of the image sitting quite low, black to mid-range, and then we have these spires, these tall spires. If we weren't clipping at all, if we weren't doing any rolling off, we'd have these spires of specular highlights, light sources, which would occupy a very small amount of the image, but obviously they're the illumination for the image in some sense, directly or indirectly. Now we're going to look at the task of color management. So that's what the camera's facing out in the world. And typically, color management has got to solve this problem. We have many camera formats, many input cameras. We now have, depends on which software you're using, either Resolve or Baselight. They all have their particular post-production working spaces. In the case of the camera, we're trying to capture dynamic range, have as much latitude for use in post-production. The post-production working space is generally bigger, has even more latitude. So we're still preserving, through stage 1 and stage 2, we're preserving latitude. And then as we go into our display space, we're making final decisions about how the image should be rendered, how it should look, and we're limiting the dynamic range in the best possible way, according to our creative intent. So let's take a look at what the camera is actually doing. It is, its sensor is a Bayer sensor. So it has photo sites underneath on the chip. And then in this Bayer pattern, we've got twice the amount of green, because green is very linked to luminance and all other things, and then half the number of alternating, either a red or a green on alternating lines. Now, essentially, from this Bayer pattern, we end up with a RGB additive color model. Now, a color model is something that can actually be taken in isolation. It's basically, you can go from 0 to maximum on each, in this case, red, green, and blue, and it's it operates in the digital space, and it's a virtual space, should I say. It has no connection to the real world. So when we talk about color models, we're just talking about the structure. But we need to take another step further. We need to say, because we need to link that to real colors in the world and values that, we can exchange, different systems can exchange, and we can talk about we can have a commonality. If we're just in the color model itself, an RGB color model, I'm sure you guys know this, but just, for example, red, green, and blue 000 is black, 111 is white, and then the corners, so the red, green, and blue corners of this would be where the red channels at peak, the other 2 are 0, the green channels at peak, and the blue channels peak respectively. These other 3 corners in between, the yellow, magenta, and cyan, where any 2 of those primaries are at peak, and the third one is at 0. And obviously any color in between that. We also, just an example of some other color models would be HSL and HSV. It's definitely not what the camera is capturing, but we do secondary manipulations in the space. I did want to mention them, but it's definitely not the primary space that the camera captures in or that we manipulate images in. We need to take a step further, and we need to go from color models to color spaces. So what is a color space? Generally speaking, a color space has got 2 parameters, is defined by 2 things. The one is a gamut, has a color gamut, and it also has a transfer function. Very unfortunately, Resolve decided to, instead of use the word transfer function, they used the word gamma. So it's a little bit confusing because gamma is actually a subset of transfer functions. Be careful of that usage. It's still intuitive. It's not, but it is a bit of a slightly incorrect technical point. So don't fall too much into the resolve terminology. Realize that when you're choosing what they call gamma, you're actually selecting the transfer function, because there are many more types of transfer functions, not just gamma curves. We have a RGB color model, and at the vertexes of, we talk about that RGB color model, we have an example of blue only, or green only, or red only. That's the most saturated red, green, or blue. And these are the three primaries that define what this camera can capture or what this display can show. And they can be plotted on this plot, which is called the Standard Human Observer. It's the CIE chromaticity diagram. It is basically like a train station, a routing that various color systems, and it's to do with photography, to do with print, to do with motion pictures, and many other things like paint mixing, and all those things, all use this chromaticity diagram, ratified the first time in 1931, and it has been revised and updated at later dates. But what we mostly use is this 1931 color model, which is based on the Standard Human Observer, because all that matters at the end of the day is what a human sees. Not what a camera measures, not what any other equipment measures, but what a human sees. And we want to make sure that the human, as much as possible, gets the correct experience. So this is the process of taking a color model, which is a virtual thing, and locking it down into real-world colors. A certain blue that can be defined by a certain wavelength of light, or a certain green, or a certain red, and those make up the color gamut, the maximum range of this particular camera or monitor. Drawing a triangle between those three on this CIE diagram makes what we know obviously as the gamut, and in the middle is the white point. So we often talk about the point where red equals green equals blue, and that's the neutral axis, either peak white, mid gray, or completely black. They all fall on the middle axis. Anywhere where red equals green equals blue, and that has a particular color temperature. So for those of you that know about lighting and color temperatures, you'll know that lights generally fall on this Planckian locus, this black body locus, from bluish all the way through to quite reddish. So when you're defining a gamut, you need to give the coordinates, the X and Y coordinates on the CI diagrams of the red primary, the green primary, the blue primary, and the white point. So from color models to color spaces. The types of color spaces, just before we talk about transfer functions, the types of color spaces that we will encounter. There's light in the real world, and I've graded out here because it's easy to discuss, and it's also hard to discuss. So let's just call what goes on in front of the camera in terms of light, let's call that linear light. And I've showed you that it's very wide dynamic range, and we have this issue of it doubling and doubling, and we try and use our camera's various parameters on the camera to capture as much of this range as we can. Broadly speaking, we have camera color spaces, whose role is to capture dynamic range. We have working color spaces, who also need to be as wide dynamic range as possible, and then we have display spaces. So let's look at all three of those. In a particular scene, just to start getting our head around this transfer function, this issue, we have this wide range of stops from the light sources, which are, could be 16 stops above the darkest black thing, and we have the skin tone and the gray card somewhere in the middle. These are the stops. Remember, we're doubling each time between each of these f-stop increments, from reflective objects to transmissive objects to actual light sources. Let's just assign arbitrary values to those camera stops. So if the first one is 1, you could think of it as distance. So think of the first one is 1 millimeter. If you were to double each time through 16 stops, the last value would be 655 meters. So you're going from 1 all the way up to 65,000, which is quite a huge range, right? Now, we've got to turn those into digital values for a computer to store and manipulate. It's quite a tough range. And the way we deal with that is this concept of stops. We are, instead of going from 1 digit to 5 digits, this wide range, we can take, 2 to the power of 1, 2 to the power of 2. We can use a logarithmic conversion of these numbers. And we can, instead of storing these huge numbers here, we end up just storing whatever the upper value is here. So we can take 1 to 16 as a way of encoding this 1 to 65,000 in a way. But there's a very important consideration, is it has to be based on how our eyes are sensitive to light in certain intensity ranges. So in very bright light, you can make huge jumps and we're way less sensitive. But in mid to darker areas, we can discern very fine differences between shades of certain brightness. That is how we do it. And this works for our ears as well as our eyes, lots of the human senses. Just on the Wikipedia page of dynamic range, that it talks generally about human perception. And you can see that in this first column here, we have 1 to, many million. We use decibels, which are log 10 based, so to the power of 10, or stops, which is log 2 based. And then you see exactly what we had. We go 0 to 16 stops, gets us all the way roughly to 65,000. So it's quite a common mathematical function to handle very wide dynamic range signals. So the log encoding has two functions. The firstly, it needs to preserve the entire dynamic range, which is a very big range of numbers. So it helps to compress them by using, to the power of this log encoding method. And then the other issue is that we're trying to encode into digital files. And we've only got 10 bits or 12 bits or 16 bits of digital information. Now, we want to best use those. And if we just spread them evenly through those, 1 to 16 stops, it doesn't take into account how our eye best perceives changes in light. So there's another function. We need to store those code values most efficiently so that we get the most bang for our buck and the most important detail gets stored without wasting bits in our files, stills, videos, and hence our compression formats. And it's a general efficiency criteria for computing in general. Just to give you some images, I mean, this is not mathematically correct, but it's an interesting representation. So if we put the linear light values, that 1 to 65,000, and we match up the two mid-grays, those two mid-gray steps. And on the right-hand side, I've got the log values. So the log values are all even now. It's just 1 stop, 2 stop, 3 stop. It seems like a linear step-by-step, but what it's encoding is actually this huge range. So you can see that we match 18% gray. And then at this point, the lowest stop of these 16 stops is only 1 pixel high. And the tallest stop is way higher than the screen. So you can just as a visual representation of how important this log encoding is. Another way of doing it is say, okay, we'll take the entire linear range, 65,000, all the way down to 1, and match it to our 16 log stops, right? In that case, you see that the middle gray kind of, in terms of height, this metaphor of height, matches, the top stop occupies the half of everything. And the middle gray point is down in the dust in the pixels there, and we can't even read it. Never mind the last stop. So just an interesting visual way to see what the mathematics is doing for us. So yeah, we've got two things that make up a color space. The one is a color gamut, which is our triangle of RGB and our white point, and the other is our transfer function. Now, it is a mathematical curve, normally a logarithmic curve, that's been defined by each of the manufacturers to best encode the signal that comes out of their camera, from the very darkest all the way to the very brightest. You'll see these graphs, and you see on this is for the new ARRI Super 35, the log C4 curve, and you'll see it's like minus 12 to plus 12 stops. And you think, can this camera do 24 stops of dynamic range? Does it have 24 stops of dynamic range? The mathematics can accommodate, the mathematical model, the curve that they've chosen definitely can, but the camera itself still cannot do that. Whatever, I don't know whatever they're claiming, but I'd always advise you to do your own test before you take what the manufacturers say verbatim. the camera can do a smaller range inside of this, but the mathematical model obviously needs to extend further than that. So we have log C4. This is red log 3G10. I don't know if any of you knew where the name came from log 3G10. Obviously, it's a log curve. That's the first part. 3 means that they want to use 1/3 of the code values, so the bottom third of the code values, to be everything below mid-gray, and 2/3 to encode everything above, and they want to encode 10 stops above mid-gray. So that was how the log 3G10 came about. A newer curve that's come out recently, when Nikon launched their NRAW, they also designed a log curve. You can see it's a lot more modest, and again, this is a mathematical model, and the camera will do something inside of this, roughly 11 or 12 stops. Check that out through online reviews, or you can do your own tests. Very similar to what I did. We mark a mid-gray level, and then we shift the signal up all the way down, and see how many stops can be moved through. So yeah, you'll see diagrams like this of showing all the different camera gamuts. Some will extend way outside of the human observer, and you'll think, is that possible? They need to extend the primaries of these triangles wider so that they can, for example, a color here. I mean, you don't have a primary here sitting in cyan. You have to move the blue primary and the green primary until it encompasses. So if I put a value here, these two would have to move even further out, because I only have 3 primaries. There's a lot of mathematical gymnastics that needs to go on to deal with these, because essentially these turn out to be, if colors actually fall in these areas, they very easily become negative values. Might be positive in the channel itself, but you might have to go negative in another channel to achieve that color, and that's where we get broken images. So it's a big concern in color management. That's pretty much a summary of camera color spaces. Now, when we get to post-production spaces, we have, thankfully, slightly more limited choices. We're working on Resolve, so we mostly use DaVinci Wide Gamut and DaVinci Intermediate. Again, it's always mentioned as 2, the gamut and the transfer function. Also, another method, the open source ACES, basically has 2 flavors, either the one for color correction, which is an AP1 gamut, and either the CCT or the CC transfer function. And then ACES also has an archival format, which is an even bigger gamut and a linear transfer function. So let's take a look at those. You see that the DaVinci Wide Gamut triangle is bigger than the ACES. You see the ACES AP1, which is the dotted line, obviously P3 and Rec 709 and Rec 2020. And then they've also showed that it does encompass the ARRI wide gamut, encompass it inside that. So we would hope that our post-production working spaces do at least encompass whatever space that is going to be an input to it. In terms of the transfer function, it also encodes a very wide dynamic range. And you can see they've listed here on their white paper that the various key points, for example, that 0.18, we talk about linear light values. 0.18 is the mid-gray, and you can see that it's at 18 nits. That's how they define it. A linear value of 1, which is 100 nits, which is normally the reference white. And their format can go all the way up to 10,000 nits, which is a linear value of 100. So it's a very wide range to work within. The first flavor of ACES is the one that we use for grading, which is this AP0 triangle, which is pretty much snugly fit to, slightly goes over the human observer at that point, but it's really meant to encompass as many quote-unquote real-world actual colors. And the 2 transfer functions. This CC curve is a straight line, and the reason why they came up with CCT is because if you don't have this toe here, you don't roll off here, and you just keep going in a straight line, the grading tools and the way that the signal functions when you're actually grading is very unintuitive, and it's very different to historically how colorists graded. So there was always this option presented. Most people grade in ACES CCT, which has the toe. That's what the T is for. As I said, ACES also presents an archival format, which has a way bigger gamut. So remember, we're always talking, what's the gamut? What's the transfer function? It has a gamut that encompasses the entire human observer and more, and it is encoding linear light values. And remember that linear light values have no particular curve applied to it. It's just the light values as they're read off on the sensor. Once they've been converted back to actual light values, and the gray card sits at 0.18. Theoretical white reflector would sit at 1, and then anything up and downwards into smaller and smaller or bigger and bigger decimal places is possible. Very important that if you're using linear files and you're wanting to export them, you must export as 16 or 32-bit floating point files, because that is the best use of the file structure. It's really designed to store these linear light values. If you're exporting in DaVinci Wide Gamut or in ACES CCT for some reason, it's not really recommended, you would rather just use a high bit depth, 12-bit or 16-bit DPX, a normal integer file, where linear files are really suited to floating point EXR storage. Right, so lastly is display color spaces. How we actually see the image. Now we've got a human involved. You've actually got to show me the picture, right? And you may have heard these sayings, like Rec 709, Gamma 2.4. You see it's always in pairs. If you just say one half, or if you say part of it, you don't actually know the full story. I've put sRGB Gamma 2.2 ... which is this slight black hole that we fall into when we deliver for web. And there's many threads online talking about browsers that are different, software packages that are different, monitors that are different, and Android, Apple, etc., etc. So I'm not going to touch that. I'm just assuming we're going standard definition TV, Rec 709, Gamma 2.4, and then I'm running for the door. Or going for cinema, which is P3 DCI, Gamma 2.6, or the various HDR formats, which are based on the HLG transfer function, or the PQ system developed for HDR10 and Dolby Vision. Here's a visualization of the various display gamuts, Rec 709, P3, and Rec 2020. This diagram also has the Adobe RGB and photo RGB, just for a reference, but obviously it's not what we deal with in motion pictures. Traditionally, standard definition displays had gamma curves. Older monitors used 1.8 or 2.0, but as mentioned, 2.4 is the broadcast standard for standard definition TV, Rec 709, and 2.6 for DCI cinema. More modern displays have, SDR is also plotted on this graph. You can see that the axes change. The hint: always read the axes. Try and read what the axes are if you want to work out what the graph means. Same curve, but plotted a different way. It looks totally different and on a different scale. So here we see how the PQ, the SMTP 2084, and the HLG HDR curves compare to the SDR 709 curve. And remember that these new display spaces, they're kind of, what they're giving us is a taller gamut. They're giving us brighter as well as wider. And obviously this brighter is actually what stands out mostly. So just take that as a summary of camera, working space, and display space. So when we come to doing color management, we need to move between these spaces. So we have wide dynamic camera source material that needs to move into a wide dynamic space and then needs to be targeted carefully to various display spaces such that we can meet delivery standards. And, designing a project workflow, very important to know where you're heading. And if you know which film festival or which broadcaster, you get the standard from them and you work towards that. That just answers so many questions. It's a very important stage. If you don't know where you're going, what frame rate, what resolution, all these questions remain unanswered. So make sure you've got an idea of what standard you're targeting and what festival or broadcaster. So basically, in our color pipeline, we're going to be taking all these various input cameras. We're going to be using what's called input display transforms, going into our working space, and using output transforms to go to our display space. In Resolve, and especially if we do node-based color management, we use the color space transform tool, and you can see how it's laid out. The space that we're going from is our input. The space that we're going to is our output. In this case, we're going from the DaVinci working space to the Rec 709 Gamma 2.4 display space. If you're going from bigger space to smaller space, you need to do something with all that dynamic range, the headroom in the highlights. You need to roll it off. You need to do what's called tone mapping. Now that's what this section is. And you'll see sometimes we use tone mapping, sometimes we don't. But generally, when you're going from a wide gamut camera space or working space to a display space, then you will definitely use some type of tone mapping. Also gamut mapping. So remember those gamut triangles were very wide on the displays and on the working space, and we've got to narrow them down, especially in the case of going to Rec 709. There's also some Easter eggs hiding at the bottom here, like what is the OOTF and what is white point adaptation? We'll talk a little bit about that, but generally speaking, if you're going from a working space to a display space, you generally want the forward OOTF applied. And if you're taking already graded display rendered material into a wide gamut post-production working space, then you'll apply the reverse. So let's look at why. And these are documents straight from a Sony presentation. Quick run through is there's terminology. The transfer functions have two types. The camera has one type and the display has one type, and they need to work in a pair, such that the light going into the camera, a very simplified version, is the light going into the camera needs to be encoded as digital bits, then into the electronic world, then transferred, used, edited, color corrected, then the electronic digital signal is transferred to optical signals in the monitor. So that is the reverse. So we have the OETF, optical to electronic, and the EOTF, which is electronic to optical. And they need to work as a pair, and they need to balance each other out. We need to have input light and output light, obviously within the possible range of brightness on the monitor, having some equivalence. So in a block diagram, we have the scene light coming in, we have the OETF doing encoding, that's what the camera does. We have our what's so-called scene referred data in the middle, and then we have the EOTF taking that encoded data and decoding it and putting it on the display. Now the two of those added together, so from optical all the way through the system to optical, back to light going in, light going out, that is called the OOTF. Opto-optical, from optical to optical transfer function. Okay, so why is that tick box? Surely it should all be simple, right? There's a bit of history, and if you know anything about broadcasting, backward compatibility is very important. You've still got to, at one stage we were still catering to black and white TVs, even though color was a very common thing. Initially, video cameras encoded a inverse 2.2 gamma, the camera that was actually recording to videotape. And then the CRT monitor, back in the day when we had CRT monitors, that was, by its nature, built into its structure, had a gamma 2.2. So the camera, inverse 2.2, and the CRT normal 2.2 cancelled each other out, and we had this equilibrium. Now, when CRTs died out, became unenvironmentally friendly, too expensive, we moved over to LCD, plasma, and other types of display. And they had different contrast ratios, different contrast curves. So it was generally found that you had to add an extra 1.2 onto the output side. And so the monitors went from 2.2 to 2.4. So the net was actually an OOTF of 1.2. So this is known as the system gamma, or the OOTF of 1.2. And so that is what we're left over with now in Resolve, is generally speaking, we always need to apply that going forward from a working space or a camera space to a display space. But if we're going reverse for some reason, we've got archive footage that's already graded, it's not a raw file, it's already graded, and now it needs to come back into a color managed pipeline and operate with other files inside of DaVinci Wide Gamut or something like that. We need to take that extra 1.2 gamma out. Just that's what those are for. And then sometimes these different spaces will have different white points. So generally you want to keep the white point adaptation ticked. So yeah, that was a very theoretical insight. Unfortunately, there's a base level of understanding that you need to have, and the more that you know about this, whether it's colorimetry, whether it's color science, whether it's photography, whether it's how linear light functions, what cameras do, and all these interchange between these various color spaces, it'll only enhance your color grading. It's not essential knowledge, but it really will pay off a lot, especially when you're dealing with clients and they find out that you're very knowledgeable on these things. I hope that was a useful chunk of theory and not too boring. So go out there and make some great looks, and we'll see you next time.